I always thought our marriage was solid, like the foundation of an old family home. Stephanie and I had been together for 10 years, and in that time, we had learned to understand each other without words. Or at least, that's what I believed. One evening, as I waited for her to come home from work, these thoughts kept running through my mind. The clock read 10:17 p.m. By this time, she was usually home, changed into her soft pajamas, and curled up next to me on the couch with a glass of wine. But tonight, she wasn't here. I sent her a message. "Where are you?" Her reply came 5 minutes later. "Got held up at work. Just a little longer, then I'm heading home." Something about that message made me feel uneasy. I opened the app where we shared our locations. She wasn't at the office. Stephanie was in a neighborhood we had never been to, a residential area on the other side of the city. A strange, unpleasant feeling started boiling inside me. Maybe it was a mistake? A glitch in the app? I decided to wait. 20 minutes later, her location disappeared. She had turned off her tracking. Half an hour later, I heard the key turn in the lock. I pretended to be scrolling through the news, though my full attention was on her. "Hey," she said, slipping off her coat. There wasn't the slightest hint of tension in her voice, as if she had really spent the whole evening at the office. I watched her closely, looking for anything that might betray a lie, but she seemed completely at ease. Or maybe she was just good at hiding the truth. "How was your day?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "Awful," she sighed, walking into the kitchen. "These clients are driving me insane. Chris nearly lost a contract, and I had to step in to fix it." Chris. I'd heard of him before. Her new colleague. She had mentioned him often, said he was smart, ambitious, a bit cocky, but talented. Lately, his name had been coming up way too often. I got up and followed her. She opened a bottle of wine and poured herself a glass. "Are you sure you were at the office?" I asked quietly. She froze for just a fraction of a second before turning to look at me, confusion on her face. "What kind of question is that?" "Of course." Without a word, I pulled out my phone and showed her the screenshot of her location. Her eyes widened for a split second before she frowned and snatched the phone from my hand. "Are you tracking me?" There was a sharp edge to her voice now. "It's our shared location," I reminded her. "You weren't at the office." She set her glass down on the counter and crossed her arms. "Fine. I stopped by a friend's place. Kate. She's having trouble with her husband and asked me to come over." "Is that a crime?" "Kate. I knew her, but something told me she was lying." I took a deep breath, pushing down the anger rising inside me. "You could have just told me the truth," I said. She picked up her glass and took a sip, her expression unreadable. "I'm tired, Mark. Let's not turn this into a scene." She turned and walked into the bedroom, leaving me standing in the dark kitchen with the sinking feeling that something inside me was beginning to fall apart. I couldn't sleep. I lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling while Stephanie slept peacefully beside me. She didn't seem the least bit troubled by our conversation earlier. Or maybe she had just gotten too good at hiding her emotions. "Kate." She said she had been at Kate's. I knew Kate well enough to be sure of one thing. She never called me in the middle of the night, never asked for help. If she had problems with her husband, she would have talked about them over cocktails with friends, but she definitely wouldn't have invited Stephanie over at that hour. I reached for my phone and opened my contacts. The clock read 2:37 a.m. I hesitated. If Stephanie had lied, then either Kate had no idea or she was in on it. I dialed her number. The phone rang. Once. Twice. My heart pounded in my chest. "Hello?" Her voice was groggy, exhausted. "Kate, I'm sorry for calling so late. Did I wake you?" "Mark?" Surprise in her voice. "No, I was just... Is something wrong?" I closed my eyes. This was it. I just wanted to check. "Stephanie said she stopped by your place tonight. Is everything okay?" Silence. I heard her take a quiet breath and then, "I'm sorry, what?" A chill ran down my spine. "She said she was with you. That you asked her to come over." Another pause. Long tense. Then a sharp inhale. "Mark, she wasn't here." I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely." In the background, I heard a muffled male voice, her husband. Kate whispered hurriedly, "Mark, I don't know what's going on between you two, but I don't want to be involved in this." I understand, I said flatly. She hung up. I lay back down, but sleep was no longer an option. She had lied. To my face. Without hesitation. Morning. Stephanie acted as if nothing had happened. She woke up, stretched, took a shower, and walked into the kitchen like last night had never even occurred. I was making coffee when she walked in, still in her pajamas. "Good morning," she said, kissing me on the cheek. Her lips were soft, warm, but I knew they were lying. I turned to her slowly. "Kate said you weren't at her place." Stephanie froze. Just for a second. "What?" "I called her last night. She said she never saw you." Her eyes flicked to the side. A pause. Then a nervous laugh. "Are you serious? You called her in the middle of the night?" I didn't look away. "Yes," she sighed, shaking her head as she poured herself a cup of coffee. "Mark, you're being paranoid. I was there. Maybe she was just too scared to tell you." "Scared?" Stephanie shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe she didn't want to get involved in our business. Or maybe you're just lying." She set her mug down a little too forcefully. "Do you even hear yourself? You're calling people in the middle of the night, interrogating them." I worked late, then stopped by Kate's. "That's it. What more do you want?" I took a step closer, looking straight into her eyes. The truth. She held her breath. For a moment, I saw something in her eyes, something dangerous. Annoyance? Fear? Defiance? Then, just as quickly, her expression smoothed over. "I'm running late," she said coolly. "We need to talk, but not now." She left, her coffee untouched, leaving me standing in the kitchen with a sinking feeling in my gut. As soon as she was gone, I opened her laptop. Same password. Emails. Messages. Browser history. Nothing suspicious. Then I checked her work calendar. She had a lunch meeting scheduled for 1:30 p.m. That was all I needed to know. 1:30 p.m. I stood across the street, watching the restaurant. Stephanie walked in. She wasn't alone. Chris was with her. I saw them order wine. She laughed. She leaned in closer. And then he reached across the table and lightly touched her wrist. She didn't pull away. Blood pounded in my temples. So this was it. I turned and walked away, not waiting to see how their lunch meeting would end. I already knew what I had to do. When you start suspecting a lie, the world around you begins to crack at the seams. Everything that once felt stable and secure suddenly becomes shaky, unreliable. You look at the person you loved and realize you don't know them. Or worse, they are no longer who they used to be. I couldn't just sit back and wait for the truth to reveal itself. I had seen the way Stephanie looked at Chris. I had seen her reaction when I caught her lying. I had seen how unnervingly calm she was, as if she didn't care that I was figuring it out. That's why I was sitting in my car, outside her office at 7:47 p.m., waiting for her to come out. Normally, she would have been home by now, but tonight, she had work again. Only this time, I was sure she wouldn't be heading to Kate's. Anger burned inside me. What if she walked out and actually went home? What if I was just overthinking? But my gut wouldn't let it go. At 8:12 p.m., I saw her. She stepped out of the building, but she wasn't alone. Chris was right beside her. Stephanie was laughing. A light touch on his arm. So small, so casual, but I saw it. I clenched the steering wheel, forcing myself to stay in control. They walked toward the parking lot. I started the engine and kept my distance. They got into his car. I followed. Chris drove with confidence, without hesitation, like this wasn't the first time he was taking her there. My pulse pounded in my ears. They weren't heading to a restaurant, not to a bar, and definitely not to her friend. 15 minutes later, they pulled up to an apartment complex. She got out first. I watched as Chris walked around the car, placed his hand on her lower back, and led her inside. I sat there, staring at the dark windows. This was it. Proof. I could have turned around and left. But instead, I opened my car door and started walking toward the building. I knew this was reckless, but I couldn't stop myself. I took the stairs up. The hallway was silent. I passed a few doors until I reached the right one. Voices. Laughter. I froze. My hands curled into fists. I took a step closer and the door suddenly opened. Chris stood there. His face turned pale. Behind him, I saw Stephanie. She froze too. And then her expression shifted. Mark. I stared at her. You lied to me. Her lips parted slightly, but she quickly regained control. What are you doing here? My fingers trembled with rage. Give me the truth. Just one honest answer. She glanced at Chris, then back at me. It's not what you think, but I already knew the truth. I turned and walked away. Her voice followed me. Mark, wait. But I didn't stop. I took my first step into a new reality, one where my marriage no longer existed. I don't remember how I got home. My car was running on autopilot while my mind kept replaying the look on her face. Surprise, then fear, and then anger. She was angry at me, not at herself, not at the fact that I caught her with Chris, but at me. I stepped inside, shut the door behind me, and leaned against it. Her voice still echoed in my head. It's not what you think. Bullshit. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a whiskey, and knocked it back in one go. The burn did nothing to clear my head. I stared into the void. Was this the end? Or was it? Part of me wanted to walk away, slam the door behind me, leave her, and never look back. But another part wanted something entirely different. I wasn't just going to sit back and accept betrayal. She came home 2 hours later. I was sitting in the dark, in the armchair, when I heard the key turn in the lock. I didn't turn on the light. She stepped inside cautiously, as if already bracing for a confrontation. Mark, she said softly. I didn't respond. I heard her set down her bag, take off her coat. Her footsteps moved closer. I know how this looked, but don't. I cut her off. I stood up, walking toward her, keeping my face unreadable. Just tell me the truth. She looked at me. It doesn't mean anything, she whispered. I laughed. A hollow, bitter laugh. You think that makes it better? I'm confused, she murmured. No. You made a choice. A conscious one. She shut her eyes. I love you, Mark. I frowned. You love me, but you're seeing him? It's complicated. I studied her for a moment. Then let's make it simple. Do you want to stay with me? She pressed her lips together. I don't know. That was it. That was my answer. I nodded. Great. Then I don't know anymore either. She frowned. What? I walked to the bar, poured myself another whiskey. If you don't know what you want, I'll help you figure it out. She took a step closer. Mark, let's just... What? I turned to her. Pretend none of this happened? She hesitated. You think we can just rewind everything? She stayed silent. I downed my drink and set the glass down. You know what's funny? I could say the same thing. That I'm confused. Her eyes widened. What? I walked toward her, leaning in slightly. What if it were me? What if you caught me with someone else? Her face went pale. You wouldn't. I smirked. But now? Now nothing's stopping me. She exhaled sharply. You're saying this just to hurt me. I looked at her and smiled. Maybe. She stared at me, trying to figure out if I was bluffing. I wasn't. The next day, I left the house before she did. I wasn't going to sit around and drown in misery. I scrolled through my contacts until I found her name. Emily. Mark? Wow, it's been forever. Yeah, it has. Want to grab a drink tonight? She laughed. Are you asking me out on a date? I smiled. Why not? Okay. I knew exactly what I was doing. I got home before heading out. Stephanie was already there. She looked tense. Where were you? She asked. Out. She pressed her lips together. You're acting weird. I shrugged. Just following your lead. She paled slightly. What does that mean? I slipped on my watch, buttoned my shirt. I have a date. She froze. This is a joke, right? I met her eyes. You broke the rules first, Stephanie. I grabbed my jacket. I'm just playing by the new ones. I walked out, leaving her standing there in the living room. But the real game was just beginning. I came home late. The faint trace of perfume still clung to my skin. A soft floral scent that didn't belong to Stephanie. I didn't rush to wash it off. The light in the living room was on. She was waiting for me. I took off my jacket, draped it over the back of a chair, and met her gaze. Good night? Her voice was steady, but there was a storm raging in her eyes. Great, I replied, walking to the bar and pouring myself a drink. How about you? She crossed her arms. Who were you with? I smirked. Do you really want to know? Her lips twitched. You're doing this on purpose, aren't you? I took a sip. I'm just following your example. It's not the same, she snapped. I turned to her. Really? You lied to me. You were seeing Chris behind my back. But the moment I do the same, it suddenly hurts? She swallowed hard but kept her composure. Are you trying to punish me? I set my glass down on the table. And if I am? She stepped closer. Mark, I made a mistake. I laughed. A mistake? That's what you're calling it? I don't want to lose you. I narrowed my eyes. But you didn't let go of him either, did you? She didn't answer. That's the difference between us, Stephanie. I won't be your backup plan. Her fingers gripped the edge of the table, as if searching for something to hold on to. We can fix this. I scoffed. We have very different ideas of what fixing means. She took another step toward me. Mark, you're not the kind of man who plays these games. I studied her face. Maybe I just finally learned the rules. Her lips trembled. You're seeing someone? And if I am? She turned away, as if trying to hide her reaction. You don't really want her, do you? You're just doing this because of me. I finished my drink. Well, now you know how it feels. I turned and walked toward the bedroom, leaving her standing there with her thoughts and her fears. I woke up earlier than usual. Stephanie wasn't sleeping. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the window. I leaned back against the headboard. Do you have something to say? She turned her head slowly. I can't take this. I tilted my head. Take what? She licked her lips. Knowing you're with someone else. Did you think it was easy for me? I asked calmly. She swallowed. It's different. Why? Because. I waited. She closed her eyes. Because I don't want to lose you. I let out a short laugh. And yet, you still won't make a choice. She took a deep breath. I have. I frowned. And? She looked at me. I ended things with Chris. I stayed silent. I know I ruined everything. I know I hurt you. But please, don't shut me out. I studied her, searching for the truth in her words. And then, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She froze. I slowly leaned over and picked it up. The name on the screen lit up. Chris. I looked at her. You really ended it? Her face drained of color. I pressed accept and put the phone to my ear. Hey, Steph. Silence. I could hear his breathing. Mark? My jaw clenched. Tell Stephanie she left her sweater at my place. I didn't take my eyes off her. Stephanie shut her eyes, knowing she had lost. I hung up and tossed the phone onto her lap. You made your choice. I got out of bed, pulled on my shirt, and headed for the door. She jumped up. Mark, wait. I stopped for just a second. No, Stephanie. I'm done waiting. I walked out, closing the door behind me. I walked away. At first, it didn't even feel real. Just movement, stepping out of the bedroom, walking down the stairs, grabbing my keys, opening the door. But once I sat in my car, reality hit me with full force. I had left home, our home, the place where happiness once lived. But happiness had shattered. I had seen the broken pieces in Stephanie's eyes, heard them in her voice, felt them in every one of her lies. I couldn't breathe that air anymore. I couldn't be near her anymore. I had no idea where I was going. A motel? A friend's place? A bar? I just drove, mechanically shifting gears, watching the city lights blur into streaks of color. And then I stopped, alone, in an empty parking lot outside some 24-hour convenience store. I closed my eyes and exhaled. Damn, it wasn't supposed to end like this. But there was no other way now. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I already knew who it was. I pulled it out and glanced at the screen. Stephanie, 3 missed calls. I ignored them. A few seconds later, a message. Mark, please. Come back. Let's talk. I stared at the words. Talk? About what? About how she tried to convince me it was over, yet her things were still at Chris's place. About how she wasn't afraid of losing me, only afraid that for the first time, I had walked away. I gripped my phone, and then it hit me. She was afraid. Afraid that I was really leaving. Afraid she was losing control. Afraid that, finally, I wasn't chasing after her anymore. Wasn't trying to hold on to something that was already dead. And for the first time in a long time, I felt in control. I didn't answer. I didn't go home. I drove straight to my lawyer's office. Divorce, I said when he opened the door. I need a divorce. He looked at me with mild surprise but nodded. Come in. I sat across from him, exhaled, and for the first time in forever, I felt like I was making the right decision. I came home at sunrise. The living room light was still on. Stephanie hadn't slept. She jumped up the moment she heard the door. Mark. I stopped in the doorway, my expression cold. You came back. Yeah. I tossed a folder onto the table. She frowned. What's this? Divorce papers. I watched her face drain of color. No. No, Mark. You can't just… I can. We need to talk. I shook my head. No, Stephanie. We're done. She stared at me, her breath quick and uneven. Is this really what you want? Yes. I could see her mind racing, scrambling for something to say. I made a mistake, but I don't want to lose you. I sighed. You already lost me. She stepped closer. Give me a chance to fix this. I looked at her. One question. Just one. She froze. Do you love me? Her mouth opened, but she didn't answer right away. And that was all I needed to know. I picked up the papers, turned, and walked toward the bedroom. Stephanie stood there in silence, like someone who had just realized she had lost everything. She wasn't going to give up. I realized it the moment I saw her expression. It wasn't fear. It wasn't remorse. It was defiance. Stephanie didn't believe I was really leaving. She thought this was just my way of punishing her, a desperate attempt at revenge. She was convinced she had time to fix things, that all she needed was the right words, the right gestures, and I'd come back. She was wrong, but she hadn't realized it yet. The next morning, she made breakfast. It was almost laughable. I couldn't remember the last time she had gotten up before me and made coffee, let alone bacon and eggs. I walked into the kitchen and saw her sitting at the table. Good morning, she said softly. I didn't respond. I made coffee, she said, looking up at me. Maybe you'd like to sit down? I picked up the cup but didn't sit. Do you think breakfast changes anything? She tensed slightly but forced a smile. No. I just want to talk. I let out a short laugh. Now you want to talk. She dropped her gaze for a moment, then looked back at me. Do you really want a divorce? Yes. Her lips pressed into a thin line. You're doing this out of anger. I set my cup down. Anger? She nodded. You're hurt. And I get it. But divorce is extreme. I chuckled. You know what's extreme? Lying. Betrayal. A broken marriage. That's extreme. She took a slow breath. I really ended things with Chris. I looked at her. You told me that while your stuff was still at his place. Her breath hitched. I was going to get it. And right before I called, he just happened to remind you? She turned away. You don't believe me. No, I don't. Her jaw tightened. You're not going to sign those papers. I smirked. Look at me, Stephanie. Do you really think I'm bluffing? She opened her mouth but didn't say anything. She didn't bring up the divorce for the rest of the day, but I could tell something had shifted. Stephanie didn't like losing, and now she was preparing her next move. When I got home from work, she wasn't there. I didn't call her, but around 9 p.m., my phone buzzed. Can we talk? I didn't respond. 5 minutes later, another text. I'm serious. This is important. I took a sip of whiskey and ignored it again. Then a third message. I know what you're doing, but if you think you can just walk away, you're wrong. I frowned. What was she planning? At 11 p.m., I heard a car pull into the driveway. She was back. I expected her to be anxious, maybe even drunk, but when she walked into the living room, I knew immediately something had changed. She was smiling. Something happened? I asked, slipping my phone into my pocket. No, I just realized you're right. I narrowed my eyes. About what? She sat on the couch, crossing her legs. Us. I waited. You want a divorce? Yes. Okay. I blinked. Just like that? She nodded. This is what you want, Mark. And if divorce will make you happy. She paused, then smiled again. Then I agree. I watched her carefully, trying to figure out what game she was playing. No fight? She shrugged. I've spent too long trying to hold on to something that can't be saved. I didn't believe a word of it. But she didn't give me anything to latch onto. She simply stood up and walked toward the bedroom. Good night, Mark. I sat there in the silence, knowing one thing for sure. This wasn't over. She was planning something, and when it hit, I needed to be ready. I didn't believe her. Not a single word. She had given up too quickly, accepted too easily what had seemed impossible for her just days ago. Stephanie wasn't the kind of woman who would just let me go. But if she wanted to play, I was going to let her. I didn't push her, didn't ask questions. I just waited. And I didn't have to wait long. I filed for divorce. Stephanie signed the papers without a scene, without asking for explanations. If anything, she acted like none of this mattered to her. But when things run too smoothly, there's always a catch. And I found out what it was the day I got a letter from my bank. It was sitting on the kitchen table, mixed in with the rest of the mail. I opened it, expecting a routine statement. Instead, notification of funds withdrawal from joint account. I froze. The amount was substantial. Stephanie had taken almost everything. I grabbed my phone and dialed her number. Yes? Her voice was calm. Steady. What did you do? A pause. What do you mean? You emptied the account. Yes, she said, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Why? She sighed. Mark, we're getting divorced. I took my share. I clenched my jaw. That wasn't your share. It's money we earned together. It's money I earned. She let out a soft laugh. So you really thought I was just going to let you walk away with nothing? I was silent, anger rising in me like a slow-burning fire. You wanted to leave with dignity, Mark. I just made sure you understood. Leaving comes at a price. You took everything. Not everything, she corrected, her tone infuriatingly casual. Just enough to make sure you learned a lesson. In life, you always pay for your choices. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to stay in control. You got what you wanted. I hope it was worth it. Oh, trust me, it was, she said, too satisfied with herself. I didn't say anything. Then I exhaled and spoke the last words I'd ever say to her. I never want to see you again. She chuckled. That, too, comes at a price. And then she hung up. I set my phone down and let out a slow breath. Well, she won. This time. But the truth was, I didn't feel pain. I didn't feel regret. I just stared out the window and felt one thing. Freedom. Money or no money. I was free. Free from her lies. Free from her games. Free from her. And that was worth everything. I grabbed a bottle of whiskey, poured myself one last drink in that house, and knocked it back. Then I packed my things and walked out without looking back.